Deep within the jagged, shadow-drenched fjords of occupied Norway, a 50,000-ton nightmare of Krupp steel lies in wait, shrouded in a perpetual Arctic mist that feels as cold as death itself. This is the Tirpitz Queen of the North, the most massive, sophisticated, and terrifying battleship ever launched by the naval engineers of Nazi Germany. Armed with 8 15-inch SKC-34 guns, she was a floating fortress capable of obliterating an entire Allied merchant convoy from 20 miles away, long before her victims could even see the silhouette of her masts. To Adolf Hitler, she was the ultimate naval insurance policy. To Winston Churchill, she was simply the beast. For 3 agonizing years, her mere existence acted as a strategic black hole, paralyzing the Allied High Command and,
at this point in the fjord,
forcing them to divert an entire armada of American destroyers and British battleships just to keep this monster in her cage. But as the wind howls through the frozen rigging and the aurora borealis dances over the black waters of the north, a far more sophisticated trap is being light, a trap not built merely of steel and shell, but of invisible intelligence, suicidal midget submarine missions, and experimental seismic bombs designed to rewrite the laws of physics. While the sailors aboard the Tirpitz lived in a state of high-tension boredom, surrounded by the granite walls of their fjord prison, the American arsenal of democracy and British ingenuity were already calculating the exact mathematical moment of her demise. This was a hunt that transcended traditional naval warfare. It was a battle of industrial endurance, where the immense logistical power of the United States met the pinnacle of German surface might. In a struggle for the very soul of the Arctic lifeline. The story you are about to witness is not just a chronicle of a sinking ship. It is an exploration of the psychological terror that a single weapon can impose upon an entire globe. It is the story of how the Allied forces, faced with an unsinkable fortress, refused to retreat, instead choosing to invent new ways to kill a giant. From the frozen docks of Murmansk to the secret plotting rooms of London, the shadow of the Tirpitz loomed over every tank and every crate of supplies sent to the Eastern Front. This is a journey into the heart of the most high-stakes naval hunt in history, where the Queen of the North would eventually meet a frozen, violent end that echoed the collapse of the Third Reich itself. Prepare yourself, for we are entering the kill zone of the Barents Sea. This is the Tirpitz Trap. To truly grasp the significance of the Tirpitz, one must look far beyond the sheer thickness of her armor or the caliber of her guns. The strategic context of 1942 was a world standing on a knife's edge, and the Arctic Ocean was the most precarious theater of all. Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had stalled in the freezing mud outside Moscow, and the German High Command realized that the Red Army was not going to collapse as quickly as they had hoped. The survival of the Soviet front was now tethered to a fragile, icy thread: the Lend-Lease convoys. These massive Allied merchant fleets, carrying thousands of American-made tanks, aircraft, and millions of tons of high-grade fuel, were the only thing preventing a total Nazi victory in the East. Hitler knew that if he could sever this lifeline of steel, the Soviet Union would starve, and the Third Reich would dominate Eurasia. The Tirpitz was the centerpiece of this strangulation strategy. By early 1942, Hitler personally ordered the battleship to the Norwegian fjords, effectively turning the coastline of occupied Norway into a jagged, impregnable fortress. This move was a masterstroke of naval intimidation. In the world of maritime strategy, the Tirpitz became what is known as a fleet in being.
Hold on to the railing.
This concept is one of the most cost-effective and terrifying uses of naval power.
Man overboard on the
A fleet in
starboard
being
side.
does not need to sail into battle to achieve victory. Its mere presence, lurking in a protected harbor, forces the enemy to react. Because the Tirpitz was sitting in the Kofjord, the British Royal Navy and the United States Navy were paralyzed by the what-if factor. What if she broke out into the Atlantic? What if she intercepted a convoy in the Barents Sea? Image a detailed strategic map of the Arctic theater, highlighting the kill zone around the Norwegian coast where the Tirpitz's shadow forced Allied convoys into dangerous detours. This atmospheric dread dictated every move the Allies made. At any given moment, the Allies were forced to maintain a massive watching force usually consisting of at least 2 modern battleships and a fleet carrier stationed at Scapa Flow or in the North Sea. These were vital military assets that were desperately needed in the Pacific to combat the Japanese Imperial Navy or in the Mediterranean to support the invasion of North Africa. Yet, they were held hostage by a single German ship that rarely even turned her engines over. The Tirpitz was winning the war of attrition without ever leaving her moorings. She was a strategic vacuum, sucking in Allied resources and manpower, creating a constant state of high-alert exhaustion for thousands of sailors who spent months patrolling the freezing, storm-lashed waters, waiting for a ghost that might never appear. The internal German context was equally complex and driven by a mounting sense of desperation. While the American arsenal of democracy was launching new Liberty ships and escort carriers at a rate that defied imagination, the German Kriegsmarine could not replace a single ship of the Tirpitz's class. To Hitler, the Tirpitz was a symbolic extension of his own ego and the perceived invincibility of the Third Reich. He was haunted by the traumatic memory of the Bismarck's destruction in 1941 and became obsessively protective of its sister ship.
Panzer divisions are left
This created a strategic paradox. The Tirpitz was too powerful to be ignored by the Allies, but she was considered too valuable by Hitler to be risked in a fair fight. Consequently, the Queen of the North became a prisoner of her own prestige. She remained anchored in the deep, granite-walled fjords, protected by vast nets designed to catch torpedoes and chemical smoke generators that could hide her within minutes. This static existence, however, came at a staggering logistical price for Germany. Maintaining such a giant in the remote, frozen north required a constant flow of fuel oil and specialized supplies, diverted from the starving panzer divisions on the Eastern Front. The Tirpitz was a parasite on the German war machine, but as long as she stayed afloat, she remained a sword of Damocles hanging over every American crate of supplies destined for Murmansk. This was the silent, Cold War of 1942 battle of nerves where the stakes were
The battleship
nothing
is
less than
here.
the collapse of the Allied supply line and the ultimate fate of the European continent. The hunt for the Tirpitz was not a single engagement, but a grueling 3-year marathon of strategic frustration and technological desperation. By the middle of 1942, the Allied High Command had realized a painful, undeniable truth: conventional warfare was utterly failing against the Queen of the North. Every time a fleet of heavy bombers was dispatched from British airfields to strike her moorings, the German early warning system, scattered across the jagged coastline of occupied Norway, provided enough notice for the Tirpitz to activate her most effective and frustrating defense: the chemical smokescreen. Within minutes, the narrow, granite-walled fjords were submerged in a dense, artificial fog of chlorosulfuric acid, rendering the battleship invisible to the naked eye and even to the primitive radar of the era. Pilots would arrive over the target only to find a vast, white void where a 50,000-ton steel fortress should have been. They were forced to drop their payloads blindly into the mist, often hitting nothing but the cold Arctic seawater, and return to base with a sense of crushing defeat. This stalemate bred a radical and dangerous shift in Allied thinking. Winston Churchill, obsessed with the destruction of the beast, pushed for a solution that moved from the sky to the depths of the ocean. This led to the birth of Operation Sauersee, a suicide mission involving this craft, midget submarines that were among the most claustrophobic and terrifying naval vessels ever built. Measuring only 51 feet in length and manned by a crew of 4, these were not the sleek, powerful hunter-killers of the deep. They were cramped, humid tubes of steel where men lived in a space no larger than a household kitchen. To even reach the Tirpitz, these tiny craft had to be towed over 1,000 miles across the storm-ravaged Arctic Ocean, submerged behind conventional submarines to avoid detection by German Junkers 88 patrols. The physical and psychological toll on the crews was staggering. They breathed recycled, oxygen-starved air, struggled with constant mechanical failures in sub-zero temperatures, and knew that any single mistake meant a silent, frozen death in the black abyss of the Barents Sea. Image a cinematic, gritty BW illustration of the interior of an Scraft midget submarine, showing the cramped conditions and the intense, sweat-streaked expressions of the foreman crew during their final approach. The technical challenge of Operation Source was a logistical nightmare. Even after surviving the brutal ocean crossing, the Scraft had to penetrate the Kefjorda natural fortress guarded by multiple layers of anti-submarine nets, acoustic hydrophone arrays, and constant patrol boat sweeps. In September 1943, 6 Scraft began their final, harrowing approach. To get past the steel nets, the crews had to wait in total silence for a German vessel to enter, then slip through the closing gates in its wake, often with only inches of clearance. Inside the inner sanctum, they navigated by periscope for mere seconds at a time, terrified of being spotted by the Tirpitz's alert lookouts. 3 of the submarine S5, 6, and 7 successfully reached the target. They crawled along the silt of the seabed, directly beneath the massive, barnacle-encrusted keel of the battleship, and released 4-ton side charges filled with Amatex explosive. The resulting detonation was powerful enough to lift the 50,000-ton battleship several feet out of the water. The shockwave was so immense that it shattered the Tirpitz's internal machinery, warped her massive turbine mounts, and jammed her primary 15-inch turrets in their barbettes. For a moment, it seemed the hunt was over. Yet, German engineering proved as resilient as the ship was massive. While the Tirpitz was crippled for months, Hitler refused to let her die. Allied intelligence watched in dismay as thousands of German repair specialists were flown into the north, working in 24-hour shifts under massive floodlights in the middle of the polar night. This Herculean repair effort meant that the beast was slowly being brought back to life, a testament to the Third Reich's stubborn refusal to cede control of the Arctic. The failure to achieve a total kill sparked a deep sense of strategic gloom in London and Washington. It became clear that the Queen of the North would continue to drain Allied resources, manpower, and nerves as long as her hull remained intact. The hunt was no longer just about military necessity, it had become a personal obsession for the Allied leaders and a symbol of the ultimate test between German industrial steel and Allied persistence. Every day the Tirpitz remained afloat in that fjord was a day the Arctic convoys sailed in the shadow of potential annihilation. The psychological blockade was far from broken, and the Allies realized they needed something more than just courage. They needed a weapon that could defy the very laws of naval defense. They needed a miracle of physics. The final act of the Tirpitz drama began on the cold, clear morning of November 12, 1944. By this stage of the war, the Queen of the North had been moved to a new anchorage near Tromsø, but she was far from safe. The German High Command, in a fatal strategic error, believed the shallow waters of this new position would prevent the ship from capsizing if struck. They were preparing for a conventional battle, but the Allies were bringing a weapon that transcended conventionality. This was Operation Catechism. At British airfields, 32 Lancaster bombers from the legendary 9 and 6 and even Dam Busters squadrons were warming their Merlin engines. These aircraft had been drastically modified, their defensive machine gun turrets were stripped away, and their internal fuel tanks were expanded to carry a single, monstrous payload, the Tallboy bomb. The Tallboy was not an ordinary munition, it was a 12,000-pound masterpiece of seismic engineering designed by the visionary Barnes Wallis. Every inch of its heightened-style steel casing was machined to a mirror finish to ensure it reached terminal velocity, breaking the sound barrier as it fell. It was designed not to explode on the surface, but to penetrate deep into the earth or the seabed, creating a localized earthquake that would shatter a ship's internal structure through the incompressible power of water. As the Lancasters climbed into the thin, freezing air above the Norwegian Sea, the crews felt the immense weight of their responsibility. They were carrying the final verdict for a ship that had defied every other attempt to kill it. As the bombers crossed the Norwegian coast at 12,000 feet, the Tirpitz's radar finally picked them up. The alarm klaxons throughout the ship screamed a final, desperate warning. Nearly 2,000 German sailors, many of them teenagers drafted in the final years of the war, scrambled to their battle stations.
The four massive twin turrets, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora raised their 15-inch barrels toward the sky.
The Germans began firing specialized fragmentation shells, creating a terrifying wall of black flak and jagged shrapnel in the path of the approaching Lancasters. The sky over Tromsø was a chaotic battlefield of fire and steel. Yet, the Lancaster pilots, hardened by years of strategic bombing, held their course with ice-cold discipline. They were not aiming for the ship itself, but for the water immediately surrounding its hull. At precisely 9:41 am, the first wave of Tallboys was released. For several agonizing seconds, there was silence as the 5-ton steel darts plummeted through the atmosphere. Then, the world exploded. The first bomb was a near miss, but its seismic impact was so massive that it physically shifted the seabed beneath the battleship. Then came the direct hits. 2 Tallboys slammed through the Tirpitz's heavily armored deck near the sea turret. The Krupp steel, once thought to be invulnerable, offered no more resistance than wet paper against the kinetic energy of 5 tons of high explosives moving at Mach 1. A gargantuan column of fire, steam, and pulverized steel erupted nearly 1,000 feet into the air. Inside the ship, the power grid instantly failed, plunging the crew into a terrifying, lightless tomb. Steam pipes ruptured, scalding men in the engine rooms, while the shockwave tore massive internal bulkheads from their rivets. The Queen of the North began to list violently to port. 10 degrees. 20 degrees. 40 degrees. Because the Germans had removed much of the ship's fuel and ammunition to conserve resources for the collapsing Eastern Front, the battleship lacked the internal stability provided by full tanks. As thousands of tons of icy Arctic water rushed into the jagged gashes in her hull, the unthinkable occurred: the 50,000-ton fortress began to capsize. In a slow, agonizing roll, the massive gray hull turned upside down, settling into the shallow seabed with her barnacle-encrusted bottom facing the sky. Nearly 1,000 men were trapped in the darkness of the overturned hull. For hours after the bombers disappeared, the rhythmic, desperate tapping of sailors on the steel plates could be heard. By rescuers on the Surfacia, haunting, metallic heartbeat that slowly faded as the oxygen ran out. The Iron Queen was dead, her frozen end a symbolic reflection of the crumbling Third Reich she had served. The physics of the Tirpitz's demise were as fascinating as they were horrifying. When the 2 direct-hit Tallboys detonated within the bowels of the ship, they didn't just cause fire, they created a massive overpressure wave that traveled through the steel corridors at supersonic speeds. This atmospheric hammer shattered the internal skeletal structure of the battleship. In the boiler rooms, the massive high-pressure steam lines, the very veins of the ship, burst instantly. Superheated steam at temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius flooded the lower compartments, turning the engine rooms into a hellish landscape where survival was measured in seconds. The German engineering, which had spent years reinforcing the side armor against torpedoes, was fundamentally unprepared for a vertical strike that bypassed the belt entirely and struck the soft internal organs of the beast. The capsizing of the Tirpitz was not a sudden event, but a slow-motion catastrophe that defied the efforts of the damage control teams. As the ship reached a 30-degree list, the massive weight of the 4 main battery turrets became a liability.
It looks magical.
These turrets, each weighing over 1,000 tons, were held in place primarily by gravity within their massive circular barbettes. As the angle of the ship increased, the friction was no longer enough to hold them. With a deafening roar of grinding steel that could be heard over the sound of the anti-aircraft fire, the turrets began to slide out of their sockets. This massive shift in the center of gravity accelerated the roll. On the bridge, the officers struggled to stay upright as the floor beneath them turned into a vertical wall. The Iron Queen was no longer a vessel, she was a collapsing architectural marvel, surrendering to the relentless laws of buoyancy and physics. In the final moments before the roll reached 90 degrees, the scene on the deck was one of absolute chaos. sailors who had been manning the anti-aircraft guns found themselves sliding toward the icy waters of the fjord, desperately grabbing onto railings and cables that were rapidly disappearing beneath the waves. The chemical smoke, which had saved the ship so many times before, was absent this time, leaving the destruction visible in the cold, stark light of the Arctic sun. The Lancaster pilots, circling thousands of feet above, watched in silence as the great gray shape of the battleship began to expose its dark, barnacle-covered underbelly. From the air, it looked like a dying whale, rolling over in its final throes. The tragedy, however, was deepest for those trapped inside. As the ship turned completely upside down, the interior became a disorienting labyrinth where floors became ceilings and air pockets were the only hope for survival. In the pitch-black darkness of the overturned hull, hundreds of sailors found themselves standing on what was once the ceiling of their cabins, with the freezing water of the Arctic rising steadily around their waists. This is where the legend of the rhythmic tapping was born. Using wrenches, hammers, or even their bare knuckles, these trapped men began a desperate, coordinated banging on the steel hull, hoping that rescuers on the surface could hear their location.
Machine never
Each
stops.
tap was a heartbeat of hope, a signal to the world above that life still existed inside the steel.
2.
Outside, the Norwegian rescue teams and German shore personnel worked feverishly with blowtorches,
Arctic
trying to cut through the massive hull
Murmansk
plates.
today.
But the steel was too thick, and the Arctic cold was too intense. One by one, the tapping sounds began to fade. The oxygen was consumed, replaced by the silent, creeping rise of the tide or the suffocating buildup of carbon dioxide. For those on the surface, the silence that followed the last tap was more deafening than the explosions of the Tallboys. The destruction of the Tirpitz was a clinical success for the Royal Air Force and a logistical victory for the American supply chain, but for those who witnessed its final roll, it was a haunting reminder of the true cost of Hitler's naval obsession. The Queen of the North had met her end, not in a glorious battle on the high seas, but as an overturned wreck in a shallow fjord, silenced forever by the very engineering she had tried to surpass. The strategic fallout of the Tirpitz's capsizing was not merely a matter of naval tonnage lost, it was a psychological decapitation of the German naval command. Admiral Karl Donitz, who had increasingly shifted Germany's resources toward the U-boat campaign, saw the destruction of the Tirpitz as the final nail in the coffin of the surface fleet. The German sailors, once considered the princes of the sea, were now a force without a flagship. Thousands of highly trained naval personnel were reassigned to the Marineschützen Division and naval infantry units sent to the Eastern Front to act as cannon fodder against the advancing Soviet juggernaut. This was the ultimate irony of the Tirpitz. The ship that was supposed to protect Germany's northern flank ended up depleting its most valuable human resources, sending its elite sailors to die in the muddy trenches of Poland and Prussia. Image a haunting BW montage showing German sailors in naval uniforms being issued infantry rifles and marching toward the Eastern Front. From the perspective of American logistics, the destruction of the Tirpitz was the final validation of the victory program. The United States Maritime Commission had calculated that for every ship Hitler could sink, the American shipyards would launch 3 more. But with the Tirpitz gone, the math became even more devastating for the Axis. The massive escort fleets that had been tied down in the Arctic were now free to implement Operation Deadlight and other aggressive anti-submarine sweeps. The Atlantic was no longer a contested battleground, it had become an American highway. The sheer volume of supplies moving toward Murmansk in the final months of the war was so vast that the Soviet ports struggled to unload them fast enough. This was logistical dominance in its purest form. Relentless, industrial crushing of the enemy's ability to resist. Image a high-contrast graphic showing the exponential growth of American Lend-Lease deliveries to the USSR from 1941 to 1945, contrasting with the decline of German naval activity. The technological legacy of the Tirpitz Trap also fundamentally reshaped the future of global warfare. The success of the Tallboy bomb paved the way for the development of modern bunker busters and precision-guided munitions.
The engineers at the Royal Air Force and their American counterparts had proven that armor plate, no matter how thick, was no longer a guarantee of safety. This realization led to the gradual obsolescence of the battleship era and the rise of the aircraft carrier and the strategic bomber as the primary tools of power projection. The Tirpitz was the last of the iron dinosaurs, a relic of a 19th century philosophy of war that had been brutally dismantled by 20th century science. The psychological scars on the Norwegian people also form a vital part of this legacy. For 5 years, the residents of Tromsø and the surrounding fjords had lived under the shadow of the Queen. They had seen their brothers and sisters executed by the Gestapo for the crime of owning a radio or looking too closely at the battleship's moorings. The sinking of the Tirpitz was their liberation before the official liberation. When the ship finally rolled over, it was not just a military victory, it was a moral victory for a resistance movement that had risked everything to provide the intelligence needed for the Tallboys to find their mark. The Tirpitz was a monument to occupation, and its destruction was the first light of a new dawn for Norway. Image cinematic shot of a Norwegian family standing on a cliff, looking down at the capsized hull of the Tirpitz as Allied planes fly a victory lap overhead. Even today, the presence of the Tirpitz is felt in the Arctic. The steel from her hull was salvaged after the war and used to rebuild Norwegian infrastructure, bridges, roads, and even the manhole covers in the streets of Oslo. Pieces of the Queen of the North are literally built into the fabric of the nation she once occupied. This is perhaps the most profound legacy of all, a weapon of destruction repurposed for the reconstruction of a peaceful society. The Tirpitz Trap ended with the total annihilation of the ship, but it began the process of healing for a continent torn apart by war. The arsenal of democracy had provided the steel to win the war, and now that same steel was being used to forge the peace. As we conclude this deep dive into the hunt for Hitler's last giant, we are left with a singular truth. The Tirpitz was a masterpiece of engineering, but she was a failure of strategy. She was a ship built for a war that Germany could never win, a war of endurance against a global industrial titan. The Tirpitz Trap was not just a story of bombs and torpedoes, it was a story of how the world's most powerful logistics machine systematically erased a threat from the map. The lifeline to Murmansk remained unbroken, the American trucks kept rolling, and the Queen of the North remained a frozen, overturned wreck, a silent witness to the unstoppable power of a united world.